We're so glad that you came out on this cold, wet, rainy morning because it's going to be a great talk. I'd like to introduce now Carol Fuller, our program chair, who will tell you a little bit about some of the upcoming programs that we have and introduce our wonderful speaker that we have today.
So today we have Dan Haifley, who's the executive director of O'Neill Sea Odyssey and also serves as the chair of the County Environmental Commission. So, you know, Dan, I think gave us an election wrap-up a couple years ago, and we have great speakers and we have great elected people and we get really wonderful programs, but I have to say Dan is the only one who always comes with visuals, you know, and so he does a great job. Everybody really enjoyed his election analysis. He had the data up there and it obviously puts a lot of time into it. So in just a little bit of Dan's history, before being executive director of O'Neill Sea Odyssey, which is an education program, a lot of kids from the Central Valley and a lot of kids who don't have, I mean, I've never seen the ocean, and you know, it's a real experience for them to be out on the boat and to be part of that program. He was executive director of Save Our Shores, and I don't know if immediately before that, if something intervened, he was also staffed here to State Senator Henry Mello, and he has a long history of working on ocean-related issues. So he's very knowledgeable, and because of that legislative background, he also is somebody I've always relied upon when I was trying to figure certain kinds of issues out. Dan would be one of my resources, and I could always count on him to be very clear, and he has a sense that people have who've served in government of good ideas are all well and good, but we actually need to figure out how much is really doable within the political system and the budget and the powers that be. So Dan is a great speaker, and we're really lucky to have him. And so, Dan, thank you.
And thank you for coming to entertain the topic, too. It's interesting because very rarely do we talk about what the state is of Santa Cruz County's environment. Santa Cruz County is known as a place that exhibits a lot of environmental leadership, but what's the actual state of our own environment? So I'm going to be going through that this morning, as well as talking about some of the recent activities. And I did bring some graphics. I brought a slide presentation to accompany my talk, and I wanted to start out with this very nice woodcut by Tom Killian, which, by the way, you can get those at Bookshop Santa Cruz. They're very beautiful. I actually had one of these many years ago, and what I like about this is it represents sort of what Santa Cruz is about: mountains to the coastal plain, to the Monterey Bay, and then out to the open ocean. And of course, we now have the Monterey Bay National Marine Sanctuary. We have a lot of protected open space, and we have really models of how we treat the environment here in Santa Cruz County that have become state and national models. So I think this is a nice representation of that. The topics I'm going to cover today are threefold. First, I'm going to talk about how county residents are working to reduce the environmental footprint in Santa Cruz County. And there is a lot going on. Carol mentioned that I'm chair of the Commission on the Environment, which under the leadership of the Board of Supervisors, and I thank Supervisor Coonerty for being here today, is working on ways to reduce county government footprint, as well as the footprint in general that we have in the unincorporated areas in Santa Cruz County. Secondly, the state of the county's environment as measured by the Community Assessment Project. There actually is a method now for measuring the state of the natural environment. It's a flawed method, but it is a method to measure nonetheless. And that's very important. When people say, what's the state of our environment? Do we know the answer to that? This is an attempt to get that answer. And then number three, what is next for the county? I just want to do a little disclaimer here also. There is a lot that's been going on in Santa Cruz County. We are rich in efforts involving many individuals and many organizations. This presentation is intended as an overview. I'm sure that I will be omitting many efforts. Some efforts will be overlooked. That's unintentional. Again, this is an effort to be an overview, so if it's anybody's fault, it's my own. So first, we talked about reducing our footprint. As I mentioned before, we have a representative cross-section of resources. One of the few places in the country that really have it all. We have mountains and forests, we have wetlands and lagoons, we have rivers and streams, and of course we have the ocean, which is now protected partially as a marine sanctuary. So the topic of my talk today, I neglected to mention this earlier, is ocean, climate, and land. And really, those three things are an integrated system. It's all one system. Traditionally, people tend to think in silos. You know, you protect the land, which is different than protecting the ocean, which is different than protecting climate. It's interesting because Mark Silberstein, who's the executive director of the Elkhorn Slough Foundation, he and I were recently out at the slough, and he told me about a professor he had in the subject of marine biology. And they were actually out on a boat one day doing some field research, and the professor told his students to look up at the coast and look up above the coast to the uplands above Elkhorn Slough. And he said, the health of the Monterey Bay depends on what's going on up there. And in those days, that was kind of a radical concept, the exception of a few folks that were involved in biology and involved in deep ecology thinking. But really, it's true. And today, a lot of the systems that we look at for protecting the environment involve land to ocean, ocean and climate, and looking at all three as an integrated system. So a couple of examples of that. Climate to ocean, for example. There has been a trend for increasing acidity in the world's ocean. And this is because the ocean has traditionally been a place where excess carbon from the atmosphere is sunk. It's sequestered in the ocean. And because of the excess carbon we have been putting into the atmosphere over the last 250 years because of industrialization, a lot of excess carbon has been going into the ocean, and scientists have been able to pinpoint this as a cause for increasing ocean acidity, which is creating a problem, for example, for coral reefs and other forms of marine life. So curbing emissions into the climate, curbing greenhouse gas emissions, will have a positive effect on the ocean. The next one is land to ocean. About 80% of plastics and other wastes that you see in the ocean come from land-based sources. They're carried through storm drains, into rivers, and into the ocean. This is what the professor was talking about, looking up into the uplands to see where there are impacts on the environment. For example, millions of tons of plastic are broken down into tiny pieces, and those tiny pieces can be found in ocean gyres worldwide. And I have a sample here of some water that was brought from the middle of the Pacific Ocean in the ocean gyre, the Great Pacific Gyre, by Anna Cummins, who used to work for Save Our Shores and now works for the Algalita Foundation and spends a lot of time out in the ocean studying plastic pollution. And I'm just going to pass this around. A couple of weeks ago, or actually more than a month ago, there was an article on the front page of the Santa Cruz Sentinel that described comments from a professor from Oregon State University who said, this discussion about there being a floating island of trash in the ocean is really an exaggeration. Well, she was correct in that it's not a floating island of trash. Plastic does not stay in large pieces for very long in the ocean. It breaks down. It doesn't biodegrade. When it breaks down, it retains its polymer properties, which are toxic, but it breaks down into very tiny pieces. So actually that's more dangerous. There's more surface area, and there's more of it, and it's harder to get to and harder to clean up. So that's really 80% of that comes from on land, and this has been shown in recent studies. Ocean to climate is the next one. Plankton that you find in the ocean and you find in fresh water provides half of the world's oxygen that comes from plant life, which is most of the oxygen comes from plant life. A recent study at Dalhousie University in Canada found that the volume of plankton for the last 100 years has been dropping by 1% per year. Now, if you think 100 years, 1%, does that bring you to zero? No. So one year you'll have a certain volume of plankton, the next year it decreases by 1% over the last year. And this seems like a small amount, but since 1950, there's been a 40% drop in volume. And this is true throughout most of the ocean except for the Southern Ocean. Scientists have not been able to pinpoint this to global climate change because there were some factors that complicated that, so that conclusion has not been reached. But it is a problem that's being worked on, and it could be a serious problem. Ocean to land. Increasing ocean temperatures, of course, affect land through more violent weather, and this is something that most climate scientists agree on. Sea level rise, which we are projecting, sea level rise would result from melting ice caps, as well as the fact that when water gets warmer, it expands, the molecules expand. So an article a couple of days ago in the National Geographic News had this very interesting quote. Top climate models predict that wet times will get wetter and the dry drier with respect to precipitation in a warming world. But that extremes will increase just about everywhere. So, and this picture was taken just outside of my office a couple of days ago with a storm. So when you think of global warming, it doesn't mean that everything's going to warm up all the time. It means that you're going to have changes in climate that lead to changes in weather patterns, not necessarily for the better. So how are we responding locally? Just a few examples of what residents are doing to decrease our own footprint. First, we're planning for the impacts of global climate change, for example, coastal erosion, sea level rise, changes that we'll need to make in infrastructure to accommodate this, decreasing species as you lose habitat, as well as weather changes. The Commission on the Environment had Dr. Gary Griggs come a couple weeks ago and talk to us about the impacts in Santa Cruz County of sea level rise, and he's a geologist and had a very, very good presentation which I can share with individuals if they'd like to see. It's a PowerPoint I would send to you, but there is some work being done in this area. Secondly is to reduce the county's greenhouse gas emissions, which the county is doing, led by the Board of Supervisors. Third, continue stormwater management to reduce waterborne pollution. Stormwater, what is it about stormwater? When it rains, stuff from the streets, stuff from your roofs, many of these things are not things that belong in the ocean, but these things get washed away and get washed into storm drains, into rivers, and into the ocean. And the county, the city, and other jurisdictions under mandate from the Environmental Protection Agency are working to manage. It's what's called non-point source pollution. It's different than a single point like a sewer outfall. This is stuff that comes from everywhere. So a lot of changes made here are changes made through education, changes in behaviors. So you're not throwing your cigarette butts on the ground, so that you're dealing with single-use plastic bags, for example. And then lastly, managing strategic open spaces. For example, agricultural easements where a grower sells, the seller is not able to sell their property for uses other than agriculture. And one concrete example is Watsonville's wetlands, which are among the best managed wetland system really in California, although just 30 years ago they were not protected at all, and we're seen as sort of a backwater in Watsonville. So the methods that are being used, I would break them down into three categories: education, research, and policy. Here's your next speaker, Senator Joe Simitian. This is just after he was on Sea Odyssey, and this was a Sierra Club sponsored trip. These are kids from Alianza School in Watsonville. This was actually when we were on the west side of the harbor in temporary quarters. First, education. Education is really aimed at changing behavior, affecting as well as perceptions of the environment. So really it's both of those things. So the general public, for example, The city of Santa Cruz and the Monterey Bay National Marine Sanctuary are establishing an education center down by the wharf, for example, which would be a great facility. Fundraising is going on for that now. I mentioned Watsonville Wetlands Watch. They have an incredible school program for the general public to learn about the wetlands. And of course, we're blessed with state parks, although they're being threatened with cuts today. Schools, there are a number of programs, including my own, that are aimed at area schools. Successful programs that get youth outdoors in a school setting have to align themselves with education standards. Gone are the days when somebody can just go into a school classroom and talk about the environment. You have to align it with the standards. You have to align it with the lesson plans, and that's what we do through O'Neill Sea Odyssey, Save Our Shores, and other organizations. So a lot of work goes into this. And lastly, incentives for the general public. Local governments have something called the Green Business Program. There are also incentives that employers provide their employees. For example, for alternative transportation, I know that O'Neill Wetsuits provides credits at the surf shop for some of their employees who bike and use alternative transportation and carpool. Second category I mentioned is research. Of course, we have the institutions of higher learning and research, UCSC, CSUMB, and San Jose State University, but nonprofit organizations also provide a lot of data. We have coastal cleanups that occur quite frequently. These are a source of data, and this is very valuable data. This is what we see that we're able to keep from going into the ocean, and it also gives us a good indication of what's being thrown away and what's being discarded and where the potential problems are. A group called the Coastal Watershed Council does a lot of work looking at waterborne pollution. They have a program called Snapshot Day where everybody goes out on one day and takes a snapshot of what it looks like in our rivers and streams. And then first flush, after the first rain, they'll come in and look at what's coming downstream and take a picture of that, and that'll give you a good data set. Surfrider Foundation does a lot of work with volunteers during nearshore water quality testing. And then of course, there are open spaces that are managed, and you have wildlife profiles, you have habitat profiles of those. So there's a lot of good data, and this leads us to policy. Research and an educated public will drive changes in policy. Of course, our community has demonstrated support for the natural environment through passing various ballot measures. 1978, Measure J, Measure C were county measures, both dealing with the environment. Measure A was land use, Measure C were environmental goals for the county. The city of Watsonville did Measure U, which integrated environmental concerns into their general plan, and that was actually a great consensus process. Other examples of policy initiatives that have been undertaken: the single-use plastic bag ban by a coalition including Save Our Shores, the Surfrider Foundation, and others. The county is undertaking one. City of Santa Cruz is undertaking one. There is an effort by a local group called Ecology Action, which is a nonprofit, but they are working on financing for solar retrofits. A green building program, this is something that's mandated by the state, but when you look at the built environment throughout the county and through local cities, the standards you use to build have a big impact, because a lot of greenhouse gas emissions will come from the built environment, come from homes, factories, and other facilities. In Santa Cruz County, you don't have a lot of new construction. You have a lot of renovation. You'll have a lot of additions and remodels, and that's where the green building program is really being tooled towards. Transportation. It's been estimated that about half the greenhouse gas emissions in Santa Cruz County come from Highway 1. So, and a lot of it from transportation, because we don't have a lot of industry here. So the Regional Transportation Commission plays a very big role, as well as the advocates for alternative transportation. And then lastly, a lot of the environmental initiatives in the county are being rolled up in something called the Conservation Blueprint. This was just released by the Santa Cruz County Land Trust. There is a website, landtrustsantacruz.org, where you can go and look at the conservation blueprint. It is in draft form for public comment. So speaking of policy, I want to spend a little bit of time on a couple of issues. First, Santa Cruz County's role as an environmental leader, and then later what we're doing about our carbon footprint. First, Santa Cruz County, as I mentioned before, has been an exporter of environmental policy throughout California. What happens here doesn't necessarily stay here. For example, Ecology Action, which I mentioned before, is actually involved in a statewide effort to promote solar financing. Something called Climate Smart was approved actually just a couple of months ago by the California Energy Commission, a very exciting initiative that will involve assistance for solar retrofits, and more details will be coming out on this soon. But Ecology Action Downtown Santa Cruz is leading this effort. Save Our Shores many years ago led the fight against offshore oil drilling and for the Monterey Bay National Marine Sanctuary with the city of Santa Cruz, and former Mayor Jane Weed is here. She was involved in that effort, as was Neil Coonerty when he was on the city council. And 26 local communities passed ordinances limiting the ability of the oil companies to put onshore facilities for offshore oil in their communities. And this was an initiative led by the city of Santa Cruz. And now Save Our Shores is leading efforts to reduce plastic pollution statewide. O'Neill Sea Odyssey, the organization that I run, is involved in promoting outdoor environmental education on a statewide level as well, mostly through legislation. We worked with then Assemblymember Joe Simidian and the statewide Sierra Club to promote the idea of getting kids outdoors as part of their school experience. And then lastly, we have a number of environmental organizations that are based here. There's an Office of the Ocean Conservancy here, California Certified Organic Farmers, Save Up Frogs is located here. So there's a lot going on here that has an effect beyond our borders. So getting back to the county and our carbon footprint, one area of policy is our response to climate change, our local response. According to the United States Environmental Protection Agency, greenhouse gases keep the planet's surface warmer than it otherwise would be. That's why it exists. It creates essentially a greenhouse, so the planet's livable. But as concentration of these gases continue to increase in the atmosphere, the Earth's temperature will begin to increase. And according to NOAA and NASA, two very good data collection agencies, the temperature has been increasing over a degree Fahrenheit over the last 100 years. The 8 warmest years on record since 1850 have all occurred since 1998, the warmest being in 2005. And then I just recently saw some data about this last season that was even warmer. So aspects of the climate are beginning, aspects of its impact such as rainfall patterns, snow and ice cover, and sea level. But despite evidence of this problem, Congress did debate but did not approve a response to climate change. They were looking at cap and trade, which is a complex system by which large emitters of greenhouse gas could go on the open market and cap the total amount and then be able to trade what they do. That was not approved. There's also been an effort to look at a comprehensive energy picture for the nation, and that has not occurred either. It's not likely that's going to occur in this Congress. California, however, is another story. In California, we produced 511 million tons of greenhouse gas emissions in 2006. It's about 14 tons for every person, man, woman, and child. 87% of those emissions come from fuel combustion, much of that being cars, 60% from industry, 5% from agriculture, 2% from waste. So people will assume that it's always the big factories and the single emitters that are most of the problem. Really it isn't, it's the mobile sources. The Pacific Institute in Oakland did a study, and they estimated that by the year 2100, sea levels could rise between 3 feet and 4.5 feet, depending on how quickly the ice caps melt. And many of the other studies, the study that Dr. Griggs is involved in, find that the numbers are very similar to this. And approximately 480,000 residents could be displaced. For example, I do business in a building that was built by Jack O'Neill in 1965 at the Santa Cruz Harbor, and I know that most of the projections have that building underwater, by about a foot, and this is, of course, on the beach in the harbor by the year 2100. Carol, you had a question?
480,000 in California?
Yes. Residents in California could be displaced. This is mostly in the coastal areas and in the around the lagoons and in the river areas. So the legislature and the governor approved Assembly Bill 32, and then later approved Senate Bill 375 to deal with greenhouse gas emissions and set some goals as to reducing those emissions so California could reduce its environmental footprint. The goals were to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to a 1990 level of output, which was 426 million tons by the year 2020, which is a 17% reduction in California. And I'll talk about what Santa Cruz County's is in just a few minutes.
Dan,
Yes.
when was that passed?
It was passed 2006, I believe, or 2007. 2007. Rochelle would know. She's works for the legislature. So the next goal would be to reduce, and this is the big one, by 2050 to reduce emissions to 85 million tons as opposed to 426 million, which is an 80% reduction. That's huge. That is the big nut by 2050. So in the next 8 or 9 years, 17% reduction in California, which is a nut, but then by 2050, 80% reduction, which is a huge nut. Yes. Yeah, the question is, would natural gas reduce that? That's a good question. I don't know the answer to that. I mean, I couldn't give you a quick yes or no answer to that. Natural gas is usually a byproduct of oil extraction. So it's a matter of how that is burned and how that's used. So I would say probably not, but I'm not going to give a definitive answer. California is not alone in taking leadership. The US is not taking leadership. California is, but other places, the state of New Mexico has very similar goals. State of Massachusetts, cities of Chicago, New York City, and others have taken strong steps to reduce their carbon impact. And we have a website down here, climatechange.ca.gov, that goes over some of the information, some of the goals. And the California Air Resources Board is working very hard to implement much of this. In Monterey Bay, the Association of Monterey Bay Area Governments, which represents Santa Cruz, San Benito, Monterey counties, there are representatives from many local governments. Stephanie is here, City of Capitola. Set regional goals of, now this is over the 2005 per capita greenhouse gas emissions, 0 increase by 2020 from 2005 and 5% increase from 2005 to 2035. The state initially set some higher targets, but given our region's relatively low emissions and population, they went ahead and approved this. Since the targets are per person, as population grows, the number of greenhouse gas, the total volume of greenhouse gas emissions can grow as well. In Santa Cruz County, just a quick snapshot, Tom Rosewall, who's involved with the Commission on the Environment, has a business called California Energy Initiatives, estimated that 48% of the greenhouse gas emissions in Santa Cruz County came from residential sources, 33% from commercial, 16% from industrial, and 4% from agricultural. If the county were to reduce its emissions by 84,000 tons by 2020, we'd be back at the 1990 level, which is the goal of AB 32. And right now that's a 3.2% reduction, so not a lot. So California at 17%, here it's 3.2%. The city of Santa Cruz was the first to come out with a full-scale climate action plan. It's in, I believe, in draft form, and comments are being circulated on that now. It's very comprehensive, They had somebody working on that named Ross Clark, who's half-time employee working in the planning department. In the county Commission on the Environment made a recommendation to the Board of Supervisors, which it approved, to develop a climate action strategy by Earth Day 2012. And I say strategy versus plan because this will be an effort by the county to work with other agencies, including the Regional Transportation Commission and others, and look at what has to be done to get us to a goal where we can reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. The county strategy will involve both adaptation to the impacts of climate change, as well as working with agencies to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So adaptation is looking at things the county needs to do to adjust if there is sea level rise, and adjust to a warmer climate, and adjust to different weather. Mitigation, reducing our emissions, will be reducing our carbon output. It's important to note that Santa Cruz County isn't going to have a big impact on the carbon output, but we are going to be affected by the whole picture, so we're going to have to do a lot to adapt. So where is all this heading? What is the state of the environment in Santa Cruz County? I had mentioned before that there is actually an effort to measure the state of the county, state of the environment in Santa Cruz County. The United Way of Santa Cruz County undertakes something called the Community Assessment Project, and this is an effort to look at the health of the community. They do this in the area of education, they do this in the area of social life, they do this in the area of law enforcement, all sorts of areas that are covered to look at the health of the community. In 2000, natural environment was added as a category. So progress for each of these goals is measured using a couple of sources. One is looking at the available data that tells you what's going on relative to the natural environment. And the second is using a telephone survey to determine what residents think is going on with the environment. So both the data that's there as well as what residents perceive is going on. Both are important. So the Santa Cruz County's Community Assessment Project had 3 goals for the period of time between 2006 and 2010 in the area of natural environment. This is measured by Applied Survey Research, which they do a very good job. It's a firm out of Watsonville. The first is that the health of rivers and the ocean is improved by reducing erosion, reducing pollution, and increasing summer stream flows. The second is that open space is preserved and increased while the percentage of housing units is increased, which are environmentally sound, green, affordable, and near transit and job centers. This dovetails nicely with state legislation, which is now, and that happened later, which is now pushing local governments in that direction, SB 375. And lastly, that single passenger auto use is reduced by improving cyclist safety, which is a big issue. You can't just everybody get out there on your bikes, you have to be able to do so safely. Increasing the miles of bike lanes and increasing use of public transportation. And here's a website where you can actually go and look at the CAP report. And this has been going on since 2000. So you can see it, look at some of the results there. Are we meeting these goals? So what I've done is I've taken each of the categories in natural environment and looked at what the conclusions were for 2010, which were released last year, obviously. First, the health of waterways. Findings were that waterways in Santa Cruz County continue to be more impaired. In 2008, 6 water bodies were added to the state's 303D list for impairment. This is a state list that indicates that these water bodies are in trouble. And water bodies on the list prior to 2008 did not improve. Also, the percentage of impaired local waterways remained the same except Corralitos Creek, which increased from 38% impairment in 2008 to 96% in 2010. Don't know exactly what I can't tell you exactly what the causes were of that, probably erosion. Protected land, this is an area that's been a positive. Nearly 1/3 of the land in the county is protected. Use can vary from habitat conservation to spaces for recreational activities, so both were included. Survey respondents had a high level of satisfaction with the county's open space preservation efforts. Alternative transportation. This is interesting. Although annual transit ridership and countywide bikeway miles increased slightly in 2009, many survey respondents continue to say that nothing would encourage them to use alternative transportation. Many families feel they need to have that car available to take their kids to soccer game, to school. I think a lot of us have been in that boat. Interestingly enough, in the survey of residents, Caucasian telephone survey respondents were significantly more likely than Latino respondents to never use alternative forms of transportation. Other notes from the CAP report. Those were the 3 top priority goals. There were some other interesting findings. Waste reduction. This is really a shining area. Annual tons of waste disposed decreased since 2004. This may be attributed to very aggressive efforts that the county and the cities are undertaking in the areas of recycling, composting, and reuse. Per employee and residents, waste disposal per day has also decreased throughout California. So in terms of goals, many years ago, the state passed Assembly Bill 939, which set a goal, ultimately set a goal of 75% landfill diversion by 2010, keeping 75% of what was going in the landfills before out of it. And the county achieved 70% by 2007. And this isn't just what goes in the green waste, recycle, and trash in your curb, or in the city of Santa Cruz or anywhere else. It's also the stuff that goes directly to the landfills. The county's been very good at measuring this, and the state has been watching it. So this has been a very successful area. Water supply, telephone survey respondents were most concerned about water in 2009, including the availability, quality, of water and its pollution. Increasing number of telephone survey respondents are taking steps to reduce water consumption, and this is partly due to aggressive efforts to educate about water conservation, increasing from 86% in 2007 to 93% in 2009, which is a nice jump. Organic agriculture. Some people recognize Jim Cochran here of Swanton Berry Farms. We had 113 organic growers in Santa Cruz County in 2009, up from 79 in 2002. Which is a very good sign, considering that many organic growers are smaller and the economy's been tough. Pesticide use decreased since 2007, 2 points on that. Pesticide applied to crops decreased from 1.8 million tons in 2007 to 1.6 million tons in 2008. The number of individual applications, the number of times that pesticides were applied to crops decreased 27,389 times in 2007 to 24,889 times in 2008. More integrated pest management practices out there. And this includes both organic and, that practice includes both organic and traditional agriculture. Beaches, one of my favorite subject areas. There have been fewer postings and fewer closures. A posting is when there is a warning placed at a beach, a sign that warns people not to contact the water due to elevated levels of bacteria. Closures are when there's a sewage spill or some other catastrophic event that you must absolutely stay out of the water, otherwise there'll be liability issues. 39 postings in 2009, down from 119 in 2002. There were 0 closures in 2009, down from 13 in 2002. And also a note, this goes to waste reduction and the gyra. This is a picture of 2 girls, Seabright Beach, a couple of years ago. I recently wrote a column in the Santa Cruz Sentinel about an effort by these kids from Galt Elementary School to remove what's called death caps. These are the untethered caps of plastic water bottles. These things are especially deadly to wildlife. That's what these kids are doing. And this is really teaching them a life lesson as well as doing some immediate good. Save Our Shores, I really credit them with really taking the concept of a beach cleanup and making it an ongoing part of Santa Cruz culture. And now they're doing this throughout Monterey Bay. They're handling the beach cleanup efforts in Monterey County as well. So what's next? We have some new goals for the community assessment project. And I just want to note that these goals don't come out of nowhere. Their goals are chosen by a committee of folks active in the environmental community. I was chair of the effort in 2000. Kirsten Liskey of Ecology Action was involved in the next 5-year stage. So they will go over all the priorities, and then they'll do a ballot and look at what the priorities of folks who are active in these areas are in terms of quality of the environment in Santa Cruz County. So the first goal for 2015 is to reduce water pollution. The health of rivers and the ocean is improved by reducing erosion, chemical and biological pollution, and improving riparian corridors. Very similar to a previous goal, except more specific about specific pollution and improving the health of riparian corridors in order to prevent erosion coming into the rivers and streams, damaging habitat. Secondly, develop local sustainable food system. Community members have access to affordable, locally grown food produced in a sustainable manner that preserves farmland fertility. So this may be organic, this may be traditional agriculture, but it's done in a way that preserves the land, which is a valuable resource and we don't have a lot of it, and provides food that you don't have to truck all around, causing more greenhouse gas emissions, and you don't have to package as much. Support for clean and alternative energy. Use of clean alternative energy and sustainable fuels that are increased through increased financial incentives and reduced policy barriers. And part of this is the work that the Regional Transportation Commission has been doing and will continue to do in the area of reducing the number of vehicle trips through every means possible. The Community Assessment Project will continue to measure other factors as well. It's not just these three, but these are the priorities. So achieving those goals will be possible if people pull together. This is actually a scene from my program. This is a team building exercise that kids do before they go on their science and learning program. So the next stage is getting involved. First of all, there is a website called ecocruise.org where you can learn about what environmental organizations are doing, different activities. The measurements I talked about before are available there. And if you want to get involved, this is a good way to do it. And secondly, supporting legislation in support of ocean, climate, and land. I want to note, and I don't want to steal his thunder, but Senator Simidian will be your next speaker coming here. He has a major piece of legislation that was up before, and it looks like it has a very good chance of passing. This next time around, it would require utilities to have 33% of their energy portfolio coming from renewable energy sources. And this bill is actually on the fast track through the special session. He's been working very hard on that. And so these are efforts that I'm sure he will be looking at in the near future. So there's a lot more to do, obviously, and this is a favorite quote from David Brower, who was a longtime leader of the Sierra Club and later Friends of the Earth. And we were actually in a television show together, and he said this, and it's always stuck with me. He said, every environmental victory is temporary, and every environmental loss is permanent. What you think about, it's really true. I think he was thinking of his efforts with Yosemite Valley and Hetch Hetchy. You know, I mean, you could conceivably go back and restore something, but it's very hard to do. Better to take care of things before there's a problem. And that's all I have. So.
You want to take some questions, Dan?
Sure. So I'll leave this up just in case.
I have one question. The goal
Yeah.
of reducing the greenhouse gases from 2007.
Okay, the question is, problem of cat feces that gets washed into the ocean and issues with sea otters. And a more recent study indicated that there are many sources of the problem. The problem really is called toxoplasmosis. And it is pegged as one of the reasons why the California sea otter population is right now at a level of about 2,700 individuals, whereas many years ago the population was around 30,000. The population of sea otters was on the rise for a while and then started to reduce, and is now at a level of 2,711 actually is the exact number, very concerned to scientists. There is a virus that's carried through opossum droppings, through cat droppings and others that actually will cause seizures in sea otters. And scientists have done analysis on many dead sea otters and found that this was a problem that led to their demise. So this goes really to the idea of stormwater management, the idea of collecting what you leave behind. So when you go out with your dog and you have the plastic bag to gather their business, the same thing with your cats. If you control when they do their business, if you control that, that's actually better for the sea otter population. And then when you look at protecting the sea otter population, you're doing a lot more for the nearshore habitats, particularly the kelp forest, because the sea otters play a very key role in managing that habitat. So what do you do with a litter box? Do you flush it down the toilet or do you put it in the trash? And I've heard it recommended from the very folks that have been involved in those studies that you put it in the trash and seal it up, because that stuff is not erased through the sanitary sewer. Okay, there were a couple of questions starting. Bert? Spanish. Yes. The question is, are these educational materials available in Spanish? The answer is yes.
And may we introduce Andrew to you so you can tell
yes.
him about them?
And just a note, there have been some other cross-cultural, cross-country connections been made through O'Neill Sea Odyssey, and we actually like having our curriculum in Spanish, and we used to translate. We've now found that almost all the kids that come through our program, most of our kids that come through the program are Latino, but most of them are English proficient. That wasn't the case a few years ago, but Spanish to English, the bridge is made better through the use of scientific terms, because scientific terms are Latin-based and they scaffold language. So it's been a very successful method, plus it teaches science as well. So we do have those materials. Be happy to share those with you. The question is about local fisheries, and is it traditionally overfishing, or is it other environmental factors? Is it a gyra? It depends on who you talk to. Right now, the counts are being done on salmon, so we'll know soon about, and probably by the time you see this on television, we'll know about the salmon season this year, but salmon have been in distress the last few years. As to the causes, that's a debate. One is availability of fresh water and the condition of the delta for those salmon. Another are environmental factors. And another raging debate is about overfishing, or whether local fishermen have done more to manage the resource. I was involved in many years with the Monterey Bay Sanctuary and the fishing issue, and actually the Monterey Bay Sanctuary, when it was established, was not going to further regulate fisheries locally. That issue's been revisited by the Marine Sanctuary, and there are state marine protected areas that are being established now where there'll be no fishing. And the federal government has been looking at the issue whether to do this further offshore, further than 3 miles out to 200 miles. I don't know the answer to that, but I know that there's a great deal of concern, particularly about coho salmon. And one is the health of local rivers and streams, and how much water is available and how much habitat's available, which is why the issue of erosion is important and the issue of waterborne pollution is important.
So I want to thank Dan. And also, you know, these issues are really complicated. You brought up the delta in response to Ron, and that is a huge issue that we're going to hear about. and with tremendous implications for the breadbasket of the world that we are in this great Central Valley, with issues for the health of the bay and all the species that depend upon it, issues of floodwater control, because there's so many people now living under these aging, cracking levees in California. Some estimates I've seen suggest that it could be worse than Katrina if we had a major storm and a lot of levees broke, with many people, and they continue to build, you know, several hundred home tracts in some of these submerged below sea level lands. So there are no really simple issues. The issue of cars, to me, is a really interesting one, hybrids and electric, because if you've got a car that's older, gets 35 miles a gallon or something, 25 even, and it's still got 10 years of life in it, what's the energy production to produce another whole vehicle and trash that one? You know, and in terms of the water bottles, maybe they all end up in landfill, but maybe that's a step above them, even if that's what happens with our recycling. That's a step above having it end up in the ocean. So there's no easy answers. We've built a really complicated planet. So plenty to consider for the future. Thank you for coming today.
Sure.